can say that it was nowhere near what it is today. I was first introduced to Prader-Willi syndrome even 10 years before the first conference. The awareness and knowledge in the medical community about the condition at that time was really poor, and the cause was unknown, or just beginning to be discovered. By 1991, we actually had learned quite a bit about the genetic cause. The deletion that's associated with about 2/3 of people with Prader-Willi syndrome, the chromosomal deletion, was discovered in 1981. And the other major cause, uniparental disomy, was discovered in 1989. And subsequently, the methylation analysis that forms the major way we do diagnostic testing for to confirm clinical suspicion came subsequently. And this diagnostic test will identify affected people and make clinical research much more accurate, because we're sure that we include only people with verified Prader-Willi syndrome. By 1991, the age at which diagnosis of Prader-Willi syndrome occurs in those who are affected had dropped considerably from sometime in the late first decade of life to much closer to the newborn period, because of the diagnostic testing. And appropriate management can then be instituted once the diagnosis is made. Without that, there's what we call a diagnostic odyssey, looking for the cause of low muscle tone, for example, and poor feeding in the newborn period, and developmental delay, etc., later in life. But now that we had the diagnosis beginning around the time of the first IPWSO meeting, we could diagnose it much earlier and institute appropriate management. So once we had a way of being sure that we were dealing with Prader-Willi syndrome, we could learn a lot more about the natural history of the condition, and subsequently about ways to impact that to improve quality of life and health in people with Prader-Willi syndrome. The other thing that happened is, having first identified the deletion, for example, and then uniparental disomy, there was an explosion of interest in Prader-Willi syndrome and its genetic mechanism, so that the number of publications went zooming up in the medical literature, so that there was much greater spreading of knowledge, let's say, among the scientific and medical community. The other major area that has an impact on Prader-Willi syndrome was the determination that growth hormone could make a difference in the natural history of people with Prader-Willi syndrome. And the first publication came in the late 1980s, and that was a single case of somebody who was treated with growth hormone and what the consequences were. It took a long time to gain sufficient data on long-term treatment with growth hormone for it to be more widely known that it was beneficial, and get approved by organizations that authorize the use of medications in various countries. In the US, that occurred in the year 2000. So it took quite a while for that major advance in treatment or management to occur. So in the bottom line is that medical knowledge and awareness of Prader-Willi syndrome 30 years ago was quite poor by comparison with what it is today. But advances in genetic analysis and testing, in delineation of diagnostic criteria to suspect Prader-Willi syndrome and get testing, and also advances in the treatment with growth hormone in particular, but other aspects of management of Prader-Willi syndrome was greatly helped by networking and collaborations among specialist physicians and scientists around the world who first met together to network in 1991 at the first international, at what turned out to be the birth of IPSO, the meeting that gave rise to the birth of IPSO. Prader-Willi syndrome is a rare disorder, even though for us it has a huge presence. So in order to have a sufficient number of people investigating and paying attention to Prader-Willi syndrome, you need to have many researchers, and to have, because even people who specialize in Prader-Willi syndrome, like I did, can only see a small number, relatively speaking, of individuals who are affected, because otherwise they have to travel from very far, and that isn't always possible. So in developing countries where there was so little knowledge about Prader-Willi syndrome and a little emphasis on rare disorders generally, it was important to have an international approach so that we could have the news spread all over the world. And really that has been accomplished. We started with a small number of well-developed countries and worked our way towards the more developing countries. There's still need for input, but it's come a long way through the efforts of an international organization like IPSO, and through the efforts, mostly volunteer efforts, of many people. One of the other things that was important, and this was done through the efforts of one of the former presidents of IPSO, Giorgio Fornazier, he arranged for a laboratory called the Bascarotto Institute of Rare Disorders in Italy to do diagnostic testing for free to the people who got tested. IPSO pays a small amount to cover the cost of supplies primarily for the laboratory to do this testing, but we offer free diagnostic testing for people who can't get that covered in their own country, and through IPSO, and that has been very helpful to, especially to some of the countries whose economics won't allow them to develop the sophisticated genetic testing that's required. From my perspective, they were the impetus for having that meeting. I think this offers the opportunity, as I mentioned before, for networking and collaborations and pooling of information that has resulted in tremendous advances. And sometimes it's hard to get a few case reports published in medical literature and in journals that are widely read. And so by pooling our data, we could have much greater impact on the medical community in general from the results of studies that are done. Every one of our conferences has had a scientific conference, and they're generally organized by the Clinical and Scientific Advisory Board, about which more in a moment, in collaboration with a local physician or scientist who knows the community and can tap into people who are more local, who might not otherwise come to the conference. So I think those scientific conferences have been critical in the improvement in understanding about Prader-Willi syndrome. Clinical and Scientific Advisory Board, as it is currently called, I think was first established as a group of knowledgeable people who could answer questions that came into the office of IPSO. And it has actually matured into a much stronger group that has developed papers that describe various aspects of Prader-Willi syndrome and how to manage it. And this material is put on the web, and in some cases is published in the medical literature. Members of the CSAB have spoken at have been tapped to speak at other conferences of other groups, such as pediatric groups or endocrinology groups, about Prader-Willi syndrome because of their expertise, as well as the fact that the CSAB is involved in planning the scientific conferences. So while there's been huge progress in understanding about Prader-Willi syndrome and its management around the world since the first IPSO conference, there is still a great deal of inequity in the level of sophistication and knowledge between developed and developing countries. The age at diagnosis, for example, varies widely, depending on ability to conduct genetic testing in many cases. And that's where our IPSO's testing program has come in handy for many people who need diagnostic verification or confirmation. But the most important thing is for people, physicians, when they see a person with manifesting features of Prader-Willi syndrome, to actually think of Prader-Willi syndrome. And that has to be a direct contact in some way. And it can be direct through the medical literature by writing review articles. It can be through conferences of various organizations. And I know that IPSO's presence as an exhibitor in many medical conferences has made a huge difference, particularly in the endocrine field. So even the fact that many members of the Clinical and Scientific Advisory Board have spoken at regional and national conferences in addition to the every 3-year IPSO International Conference has also made a difference in understanding about Prader-Willi syndrome. So that's been helpful, but there's still a long way to go. When grant funding has been made available through fundraising for setting up such conferences, there's usually quite a number of different countries that request the funding so that they can improve knowledge locally about Prader-Willi syndrome, particularly in developing countries. So increasing awareness and education has been a major focus of IPSO generally and the Clinical and Scientific Advisory Board specifically. But progress, although it's clearly being made, is slow, and often this is a financial issue. So we still have a ways to go. But if we continue to organize local conferences, I think that's going to make a big difference. And in terms of the science, we still don't have the ability to suppress the drive to eat, and that impacts health and behavior in Prader-Willi syndrome and to a significant degree. And so there's still much for us to learn. And IPSO, I think, is going to play an important role in understanding what kinds of interventions are likely to be helpful in that regard. So there's still much to learn.
Hello, my name is Marguerite Hughes. I'm the CEO of IPSO. The day my son was diagnosed with Prader-Willi syndrome over 17 years ago was one of the saddest days of my life. It was also one of the luckiest, because getting that diagnosis just a few weeks after his birth meant that his father and I could learn how best to care for him. There are many countries in which diagnostic testing for Prader-Willi syndrome is unavailable or unaffordable. For the last 18 years, IPSO has provided a free diagnostic testing service to families from 49 countries. Each diagnosis costs IPSO €200, and we rely entirely on donations to provide this service. If, like my son, your child was diagnosed, please help another family to also receive a diagnosis by donating what you can at www.ipso.org. Thank you.